Good morning, friends. Before we get started on today's lesson, you're going to need a couple of things. This is history, so make sure you have out whatever pens you choose to use for history class, if that's your Papermate clear pens or your colored pens. Let's take those out, and then you are also going to need 3 colored pencils today. We need to finish the map on page 74. So I used purple and yellow, so I have out my purple and yellow colored pencils, and then you will also need to get out a green colored pencil. So make sure you have all of those supplies. And then the other thing I want you to do before we get started is the last page we did was page 75. We have not finished it yet. But I want you to go ahead and turn the page and set up page 77. You'll see the title is still Roman Empire. Today's date is April 2nd, 2020. So that's page 77. And then I want you to do the same thing on page 79, the same title, Chapter 5, Roman Empire, with today's date. So you're adding 2 more pages, page 77 and 79. So go ahead and pause the video, get everything set up, and then when you're ready, we'll review and get started. So we left off having already learned about early Rome and the Roman Republic. And if you recall, early Rome started off just this little teeny tiny red area right here when the Latins settled on Palatine Hill and eventually expanded to create the starting days of Rome. Early Rome was ruled by kings. They had a total of 7 kings, and eventually the Romans rebelled against the Etruscan kings, and the early Rome fell, the kings fell, and that was the start of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was ruled by a Senate, and during the time of the Roman Republic, the Romans fought a lot of battles, especially against Carthage, and if you would like to go review those, you can go review your notes on the Punic Wars. So they fought a lot of battles, and eventually they conquered all of this territory that you see in orange. And at the end of the Roman Empire, there was a man named Julius Caesar who came into power, and he declared himself dictator. And he actually did quite a few good things while he was dictator, but the people in the Senate didn't like that he decided he was dictator and that he didn't take anyone else's opinions into account. So they murdered Julius Caesar. And when they murdered Julius Caesar, that's about where we left off. So I'm going to go to page 75. I'm going to review where we left off, and then we'll get started on what happens next. So after they murder Julius Caesar, Mark Antony is the one who is set and ready to take over, because people think that Caesar's son, Octavian, is too young to become the ruler. But Octavian wants to be the ruler, Mark Antony wants to be the ruler, so they start competing for rule. And eventually they realize it's going to be a lot better if they join forces and conquer Rome together rather than fighting against each other. So that's exactly what they do. They join forces, they defeat all of their enemies, and by 42 BC, they have conquered Rome and all of its territories. But remember, Octavian and Mark Antony do not like each other. They do not get along. They don't want to get along. So they say, you know what? It'll be a lot better if we divide the territory between us. So Octavian takes the Western Empire, and Mark Antony takes the Eastern Empire. And that is where we were coloring the map, and I believe we did not finish coloring the map. So if you did not finish coloring the map, here is my completely colored map. You can pause that for as long as you need to finish coloring in. Here we have the Western Roman Empire, which belonged to Octavian, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which was Mark Antony. So actually, I think I'm going to add that as a note on here. So the Eastern Empire is Mark Antony. And we'll come up this way. The Western Empire is Octavian. So over time, they've divided their land, but they still are quite suspicious of one another. They don't really like each other. They don't trust each other. So in the meantime, Antony decides to move to Egypt with Cleopatra. Now remember, at this time, Egypt is the last remaining Greek-controlled land in the world. So Cleopatra is a Greek ruler. She rules Egypt at this time. So Antony moves to Egypt with Cleopatra, and Octavian and Antony, their distrust continues to grow. So in the year 31 BC, which if you remember, that's the year that Greece finally fell. In the year 31 BC, Octavian defeats Antony. He conquers all of Antony's territories and becomes the ruler of Rome. So that is where we will pick up with our new notes. So our next title is going to be Hail Augustus. And some of this you should have picked up from the Brain Pop video that we watched. So hopefully this is maybe a little bit of a review for you now. So Octavian becomes the emperor of Rome. And when he becomes the emperor, he takes a new name. His new name is Augustus, which means deeply respected one. So many Roman emperors after this were in the habit of taking a new name, just like the first emperor Augustus did. Octavian would pretend to ask the Senate for help, to ask them for advice, but in reality, he was basically a dictator, and Octavian did whatever he wanted. So he is who we consider to be the first emperor of Rome. And he ruled wisely, and he brought peace to Rome. And Octavian, or Augustus, as he was then known, ruled until his death in AD 14. Remember, we write the letters AD before the year, and when we're writing in BC, we write the year, and then BC comes after. So if you notice, 31 BC is when he conquers all of Rome. He rules until AD 14. So in the middle, we come to the year 0, which is when Jesus was born. So Augustus was the emperor at the time of Christ's birth. He was not the emperor at the time of Christ's death because Jesus was 33 when he died. So that would be the year AD 33. So Augustus had already died by the time of Jesus's crucifixion, but he was the emperor when Christ was born. And then if you recall from the Brain Pop video, I'm going to switch colors. But you know what? I ran out of room, but that's okay. We're going to put one more thing on here. So next came the Pax Romana. And starting with Augustus, we'll squeeze it in and we'll just go onto your summary line just a little bit. Okay, so with Augustus's rule, it was the beginning of the Pax Romana, which was a period of 200 years of peace for Rome. So Rome experienced 200 years of peace. You guys can probably hear that noise. They're doing a little bit of construction outside, so the trucks keep moving. So hopefully that's not too distracting. I know you guys are capable of focusing, so I trust you to be able to focus. All right, let's go ahead and turn to page 77, which you should have already set up. That should be ready to go. And we are going to continue our notes on the Roman Empire. So I talk about what the rule of the emperor looked like. So the emperors ruled for about 400 or 500 years. And if you were emperor, you could essentially rule however you wanted. They ruled however. You were the sole person in charge. You did not have to consult other people. Now, they would pretend to consult the Senate, just like Augustus did, but in reality, they just did exactly as they pleased. They didn't have to follow anybody else's rules. The emperor just did what he wanted. If you wanted to become emperor, I'm going to put a little title, Becoming Emperor, and then make sure you indent and switch to the other bullet point. Remember, that means that anything that I write here is related to becoming emperor. So at the beginning, at first, if you wanted to become emperor, you had to be related to the old emperor. Just like if you want to become king, then your dad has to be the king and then you become king, okay? So they had to be related to the previous emperor, to the last emperor. But later on, there was an emperor named Nerva who started a new tradition, because before he died, he actually selected his own successor. And so then that became the tradition that the emperor, before he died, could say, I want my friend to become emperor after I die. I want my political ally to become emperor after I die. So then the emperor could choose his own successor. So later on, the emperor chose his own successor. The first several emperors that Rome had were not very good rulers. So even though Rome was experiencing a time of peace, the emperors themselves were not very trustworthy. There was a lot of betrayal. People tried to take over as emperor, so a lot of people were killed, a lot of people were murdered. So they were not very good emperors at the beginning. First several emperors were bad. But eventually, later on, Rome had some fair rulers who did some good things for Rome. All right, I'm going to switch colors for my next bullet point. Remember, you should only switch colors when I switch colors. You don't need a new color on every line. I will tell you when to switch colors. So let me move the page down for you. All right, the heading of this part is going to be Life in Danger. So if you were the emperor, your life was constantly in danger. If you became unpopular, people might want to kill you, or people might be jealous of your position, so they might want to kill you for your position. So I'm going to write down those two reasons right there. So emperors were threatened. If they were unpopular. Or by jealous rivals. So to protect themselves, the emperors had the Praetorian Guard. These were like their bodyguards. This was a special group of soldiers, and their job was to protect the emperor. So they were some of the closest people in the emperor's life because they were always with him, protecting him. And because they were his closest people, they were actually the people who were in the best position to murder the emperor. So some of these guards, these soldiers, did not like the emperor. They decided that he was not the person who should rule. They had their own ideas about that. So since they were very close to the emperor and they were trusted and he thought they were protecting him, they would actually sometimes murder the emperor. So as you can see at the beginning of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of distrust. There was a lot of murder. There were a lot of bad actions. No one could really control the emperor, so the only way to get him out of there was to kill him. So that was not a great time to be the emperor. But later on, you will see that some good things happened in Rome. Right, that is the end of page 77. So let's turn to page 79. And I told you before that we were going to expand Rome one more time. We started off with that little teeny tiny red dot of early Rome, and then we extended it into the orange when they fought battles with Carthage and started to conquer more lands. And now Rome is going to conquer even more territory. So let's write our title, Expanding the Empire. There was an emperor named Trajan. And it was under Trajan's rule that Rome reached its largest. He was a very talented commander, and he took his legions, his army, on a lot of conquest around all of Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and he conquered huge areas of land. So under Trajan, he ultimately ruled Rome's largest empire. In about 20 years, he took Rome from that little orange on our map. And in just a minute, we'll go back and color that map. But he expanded Rome so that it stretched 2,500 miles. From east to west, Rome stretched 2,500 miles, all the way from Britain to the Middle East. So he ruled the largest empire, and actually I can show you. We'll go color it in just a minute. So that red right there is Rome, the Roman Empire at its largest. That's what Trajan conquered. So here's Britain up here. And then the Middle East, you'll see, is over here. All of these provinces are in Latin because they're the names of the Roman provinces. So they're not as we know them in English. So they conquered all of Northern Africa, up here, the Middle East, most of Europe, all the way up to Britain. So that was Rome under Trajan's rule. Well, as you can imagine, if I'm the ruler and I live in Italy and I have people under my rule who live in Britain, I don't exactly have a lot of control over them because they're so far away. So those people who live far away would rebel. So there was a lot of rebellion during this time because a large empire was hard to control. So many different regions rebelled. And eventually what happens in the midst of all these revolts is that another emperor comes into power. His name is Hadrian, and he decides that the empire was way too big to control. So rather than try to control all of the people, he says, you know what, let's just give up some of the land. We don't need to control all of this, let's just give up some of the land. And so he gave up some land, and then he built permanent fortresses along Rome's border to protect Rome. There's a famous wall that he built. It was in Britain. It's called Hadrian's Wall, and it stretched for 80 miles across Britain. And there are actually still parts of it that are standing today. You can go to England and you can see them. So he built this fortress to protect Rome. He said, you know what, we don't need all of that territory. Let's make our territory smaller, and let's build some fortifications so that we can protect the territory that we do have. I'm not going to ask you to write down that whole story. I just thought it was an interesting fact for you to know. So what we're going to write down is that eventually Rome gave up some territory. So let's go now back to our very first page, to the map. Let's see what page it's on. It is on page 64. And let's add the Roman Empire to this map. So you are going to need your green now. This one does not have lines on it like our other map did, so you're gonna have to watch what I do. So here we have Britain. And there's a little line in the middle. We're gonna go just above that line. And we're gonna color in. That might not be dark enough for you guys to see that. Let me see if I can get a new color green. Okay, so there's what Britain will look like. And then these lines right here are rivers. So we're gonna come above this river over here. We're gonna come just above it and draw a line down, and we're gonna connect to this river. And this river actually becomes our border all the way over to the Black Sea. That's gonna be our border. So you can color everything in here all the way over to the Black Sea. I'll go back and color it as soon as I show you all the borders. And then we come up under the Black Sea. You're gonna draw a connection like this, okay? Come down, we have our Tigris and Euphrates over here, so they conquered that land too. Come back up, connecting down to the tip of the Red Sea here. And then we can come out of the Red Sea, swoop up a little bit. We're gonna go just a little bit under the territory that they conquered before, all the way over to the tip of Africa over here. And then you can go ahead and color all of that land in. This is Rome's empire at its largest, which is when Trajan ruled. So as you can see, he conquered a lot of land. He more than doubled the size of the empire as it was during the Roman Republic. So there's my fully colored map of the Roman Empire. Make sure you get this little island right here in the Mediterranean Sea. And then the last thing that we need to do is come down to our map key or our legend. And let's color that last box green. And then next to it, we need to write Empire. This is the Roman Empire. And then we're going to turn back to page 79 and finish that page. We're going to talk about how the empire was ruled. So let's start with our heading, which is running the empire. So the Roman Empire was so vast, so massive, and it was home to so many different people that ruling was a very, very difficult task. So to make things easier, the Romans organized their territory into lots of different provinces, and then they built a bunch of roads to connect those provinces, and they used their soldiers to help rule. So I'm going to show you what those provinces looked like. It's the same map that I showed you before. Let's see. So each of these is a different province of Rome. Let me turn off that light and see if I can get rid of the glare. You can see all of these little lines. Each of these lines divides up the provinces. So what is today modern Italy was one province, and then all of these other territories out here were divided into different provinces. So they divided up their territory to make it a little bit easier to rule. So let's write that down. Rome was organized into provinces. And each of those provinces was ruled by a governor. The governor usually came from Rome. Not always, but usually he came from Rome because he was a Roman citizen if he came from Rome. An example of a governor that you probably know is Pontius Pilate. He was the governor of Judea, which is where Jerusalem is. It's where Nazareth is. It's where Jesus spent his life. So Pontius Pilate is an example of one of those governors that you probably know. And they had all of these provinces, and they needed a way to get from one place to another. So what they did was they built a massive network of roads to connect each province to each other, and then to connect all of the provinces to Rome. So the provinces were connected by a network of roads. And the Romans were incredible engineers. A lot of the roads that they built still exist today. And all of the roads in all of the provinces eventually connected you back to Rome, because they used the roads for their army, they used them for trade, but they also used them for imperial messengers who carried information back and forth on horseback from one part of the empire to another. And if Rome is the center, Rome is where they need to get. So all of the main roads had post houses, like a post office kind of, down them. And so a messenger could start in Rome on one horse. He could ride to a post house. He could give that post house his horse, and he could take a new, fresh horse who's not tired. And then he could ride to the next post house, and then he could swap it for a new horse. So in an emergency, news could travel as far as 150 miles a day on horseback. That's quite a distance to cover as you're riding on a horse. If you've ever heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, that comes from this network of roads that they built that connected their entire empire. Rome also continued to collect taxes. If you remember back to when we talked about the Roman Republic, if you were a citizen, you were exempt from paying taxes, but everyone else had to pay taxes. Well, now, if you look at the entire empire, Rome has a lot of people to collect taxes from. So they were collected all over the empire. And they used the taxes to pay for their army, to pay for public buildings, to pay for when they gathered drinking water, they would use the money to pay for that. So they used it to pay for things that everyone used, things that benefited their citizens. Used to pay for army and public buildings. And then something that changed during the time of the Roman Empire was citizenship. I'm going to flip back to, let's see what page it is. Page 71. If you remember, during the time of the Roman Republic, a citizen was anyone who was born in the city of Rome to Roman parents. And so a non-citizen was anyone born outside the city of Rome or anyone who was a slave. So what happens in the Roman Empire is that there's an emperor in 89 BC who decides that this is the province right here, this is the province of Italy, the boot, remember? So they decide that instead of being a citizen if you live in the red, you're going to be a citizen if you live in the boot. So they extended it to the entire boot, to the province of Italy, and those were considered their citizens. So this happened in 89 BC. If you live in Italy, you are considered a citizen. Then fast forward almost 300 years to the year AD 212. At this point, there was an emperor who decided that every free man living within a Roman territory would become a citizen. So if you were free, meaning you're not a slave, okay, so as long as you're not a slave, if you live anywhere in this green and the orange and the red, if you live anywhere in here, you are now considered a citizen. So all free men were granted citizenship. And what this did was it gave people a sense of belonging, and it helped to unite the empire. So the empire was actually a lot stronger after they granted citizenship to all of the free men. And I just realized I don't have a page number on here. It says page 79. So that is where we are going to stop for today. That is actually the end of the Roman Empire. So from here, we'll start learning about everyday life in Rome, what that looked like for men, for women, for children, how they, their religious beliefs, kind of the same thing we did with Greece, but we'll look at it from the Roman perspective. And then we'll talk about how Rome fell and the legacy that they leave for us today.